Can't wait to get out of here. Last night we were sitting around the dinner table, and I asked the kids, I said, hey, do you know what tomorrow is? And all three of them gave an answer that was correct, but not the answer I was looking for. I said, hey, do you know what tomorrow is? And Madison goes, it's Sunday, which was right, but not the answer I was looking for. Bryce, he goes, it's a family day, which is true. Sunday is a day we spend most of the time as a family. And Nathan goes, it's football day, which is also true, and I'm sure it was probably some of your answer as well. None of those were what I was looking for. There's actually something more that's unique about today. Anyone know what's unique about today?
Christmas Sunday.
Kind of Christmas Sunday, yeah, sure. Today's the winter solstice, which means it's the first day of winter. But do you know what else the winter solstice means? Yeah, today is the shortest day of the year. And I don't mean it has any less than 24 hours, but of daylight, today is the day that has the least amount of daylight. Every day before today was getting darker and darker and darker. After today, it'll get lighter and lighter and lighter. What's really, I didn't plan this at all, but I just love that this worked out like that, is today we're talking about darkness and light. And that just sort of happened, which is kind of fun. Our task this morning, as we open up the scriptures, is to remind ourselves of what we're really celebrating at Christmas. Because believe it or not, we're not celebrating fireplaces or tinsel. We're not celebrating the exchanging of gifts or of warm hugs. No, we're celebrating the fact that God made good on His promises to heal the world, to save the world, that God, He did not forget. Because here's the thing with these promises that take a long time to fulfill, is that sometimes we can lose hope. Sometimes we can forget. It's like that school year that keeps going on and on and on. It feels like it's never going to get end, and then we get weary with all of the waiting. Here's sort of the phrase that I've been sort of thinking about all week, and if you remember only one thing from today, I hope it's this phrase that Christmas begins in the dark. Christmas begins in the dark. There are all these images throughout Scripture, especially around the Christmas story, these images between light and dark. And if you've been with us, we've been going through the book of Luke this whole fall, and even into this Advent season, we've been looking at Luke's account. And we've met this one individual by the name of Zechariah. He's this aging, doubting, mute priest. An angel of the Lord appears to him, and he doesn't even have enough faith to believe what he tells him, and so he loses his ability to speak. The angel promises he's going to have a child. His son's going to be John. He's going to prepare the way for the Messiah. He loses his ability to speak when his son finally is born. Miraculously, he regains his speech, and he sings a song. And I only want us to look at a couple lines of that song this morning. So if you have your Bibles, turn to Luke chapter 1. We're going to look at verses 78 and 79 this morning. You actually already heard them this morning in our Advent reading. But here's these two lines of this Song of Zechariah. He says, because of the tender mercy of our God, by which the rising sun will come to us from heaven, to shine on those living in darkness and in the shadow of death, to guide our feet into path of peace. You hear what he's saying? Because of the tender mercy of our God, and then he gives us this poetic image. He says, the sun shall rise and give light. Last year there was a charitable organization that sent out a Christmas card to everyone who either donates to them or is involved with their organization. They sent out a Christmas card, and I couldn't actually find the card, but I remembered it this year, especially as I was looking at this verse, because it used this verse. On the front of the card, there was this picture of a sunrise, something like this, and it had the first part of this verse. It says, because of the tender mercy of God, by which the rising sun shall come to us from heaven. I don't know if you have that on the next slide. So that would be the front of the card. Then you'd flip open the card, and it would have the second part of this verse. To shine on those living in darkness and in the shadow of death. and it would have the picture of this impoverished people. Christmas begins in the dark. I mean, think about it. The world that Jesus was born into, as the Son of God, it wasn't a good time. It wasn't a particularly peaceful time. It wasn't a particularly comfortable time. And you know how every once in a while when you're watching the news or maybe you're watching some other show, before the show starts there'll be sort of a warning, a sign of what's to come, and it'll say, some viewers may find the following video disturbing. Viewer discretion is advised. Did you know that Christmas is a bit disturbing? Because it begins in the dark. In fact, one writer, Fleming Rutledge, she says this. She says, Christmas is not for the faint at heart. To grasp the human predicament, one has to be willing to enter into the very worst, giving serious consideration to the most hopeless situations. So this morning, can I take you by the hand and can I walk us into the dark part of Christmas? When Jesus was born, his birth brought all sorts of trouble. He was born into a world of trouble, and his birth caused even more trouble. In fact, immediately after he was born, there was a ruler in that land. His name was Herod, and he was so insecure, and he was so threatened by this would-be king, even if he was a baby, that he decided he was going to end the life of this child. The only problem is he didn't know which child it was. And so that was no problem for him. He was going to just wipe out every male child in that region. Matthew records it this way. When Herod realized that he had been outwitted by the Magi, he was furious. And he gave orders to kill all the boys in Bethlehem and its vicinity, who were 2 years old and under, in accordance with the time he had learned from the Magi. Can you imagine that? I mean, can you imagine that in this room? Or in our town? Mary and Joseph, they had to flee to Egypt as refugees to escape this massacre from Herod. Jesus came into a world of darkness. Christmas begins in the dark. And God came. And you see, the world that you and I live in today is not that different. There is still darkness. And what do we mean by darkness? As I've been thinking about how to sort of talk about this and illustrate this, I think a picture, a tangible way will really help us get this. And it's kind of fun for me. I've asked my daughter to come and help me sort of pull this off. Come on. I want us to imagine that we are on one side and God is on the other side. And now imagine with me all the things that are hard about our world. The things that make this world dark. Now, some of you immediately probably think of illness. Maybe dementia. Maybe cancer. Some of you maybe immediately think of the different hostility that exists in relationships. You know, as a church this year, I've thought a lot about we've had a lot of loss this year. Death in different families in our church. People, every one of whom was too young. People who we were not yet ready to say goodbye to. It is a hard world. There's injustices. There's hostility between nations. There's the growing divide between the rich and the poor. There's the misuse of power. Those who have been entrusted with power are using it on themselves instead of for those whom they were entrusted to care for. This ever-growing wall that divides people. It's hard to imagine why God would want anything to do with a place like that. A place that's so broken, a world that's so out of whack. But did you know that's the same world that Jesus came into? The world was like that even before Jesus. In fact, there's a place where Isaiah the prophet, hundreds of years before, he yells this out. He says, "Oh, that you would rend the heavens." You know what rend the heavens means? It means that you would rip open the heavens. And God, that you would come down and that the mountains would tremble before you. I mean, that was the cry of Isaiah for his people. The cry the cry of the world before God came. And we could also talk about it like this. We can talk about the things outside of us that stand in the way. But we can also talk about the internal things that are difficult, that are broken, that are dark, that make life hard. We could talk about the fact that every person in this room has experienced some sort of hardship this year, some sort of grief. Maybe it's some choices or decisions that you've made that you feel like you have to pay for. Maybe some of you feel like you're living in the valley of the shadow of shame. And there's some relationship that you're living in sort of the aftermath of. Maybe with a spouse, with kids. Relationships that just didn't go the way you'd hoped. Some of us, we build this sort of wall intentionally with our own insecurities. If people saw who I really was, if they knew what I really did, who I really am, there's no way they'd find me lovable. And so we build a wall as a little bit of protection, a barrier. And we say, I'm never going to get hurt like that again. I'm never going to let anyone get that close again. I'm not going to experience that kind of loss. So it's not just the world that feels isolated. It's not just the world that feels walled off. What do you think it's like to live behind this wall? What do you think it's like? It's lonely. I don't think it's any coincidence that it's around the holidays that this feeling of loneliness is most perceived, it's most pervasive. I was looking at a website this week. It's called the Loneliness Project. And on it, a bunch of different people, they write about what loneliness means to them, what their experience of feeling alone is like. And you'd be surprised, it's not just the social outcasts that are writing. It's people who on the front, everything looks great, and yet behind, there's a lot of loneliness. And I was struck by this one gal named Erin, age 34. This is what she writes at the end of what she describes. She says, loneliness is an inescapable and cyclical part of being human. We are all interconnected and also unchangeably separate. Trying to run from feeling lonely only causes you more pain. I remind myself of this very often. You see, when we talk about Christmas beginning in the dark, we're talking about a world that's walled off, that's living in isolation, a world that's just wandering. And then God comes. And then God comes. What does it take when the one that you love is walled off and is living in isolation and loneliness? What does it take? Some of you might, if you're old enough, you might be remembering the old Kool-Aid commercial. You remember that? Where it just busts out of there. The problem is we're not strong enough. We're not strong enough to bust out of there. And so here's what God does. And this is why we celebrate a thrill of hope. The weary world rejoices, for yonder breaks a new and glorious morn. That's what Zechariah is saying in this passage. He's saying the light is coming to those living in darkness, those in the shadow of death. How does the light come in? Well, God breaks into our existence. God comes. He comes. Are you okay? Okay. He comes to live among us. He comes to us in the brokenness. You can sit down. Thanks so much. And here's the shocking thing. The really shocking thing. If we could have seen the world that Jesus came into, if we could have seen that world, we would have said, okay, of course, I know exactly how God's going to come. God is going to come like a cosmic avenger. And he is just going to clean up the place. He's going to make all the wrongs right. But the shocking thing, the absolute shocking thing, is that Jesus comes as a helpless baby. And, just think about it. A helpless baby at the whim of a young adult couple with their first child. I mean, we all screw up our first children, don't we? This young adult couple with their first kid in the Middle East, this brutal time where people were just trying to live and get by. God comes as a baby. And not just that. John chapter 1 tells it this way. It says, the true light that gives light to every man was coming into the world. That's Jesus. That's this light shining in the darkness. He was in the world, and though the world was made through him, the world did not recognize him. He came to that which was his own, but his own did not receive him. Yet who also received him, to those who believed in his name, he gave the right to become children of God. See, the light, it's shown in the darkness. But it's almost like, you know what? We like our darkness. And we said, you know what? Maybe we'll just build these walls a little bit higher. Because it actually feels a little bit safer to live behind the comfort of these walls than sort of take the scary step of coming out. But here's actually what Jesus came to do. Jesus, as he lived among us, he taught us. He loved us. He healed. Jesus, he came to be rejected by the very ones that were supposed to receive him. You see, Jesus, this God in flesh, this God's Son, he came to die. And no, he wouldn't just die a common death, die of natural causes. He wouldn't just die of old age. Now he would give his life for the sins of the world. You know what believing in Christmas means? It means living in the tension that God came at first, but that he's still coming. That the light has shone, and yet there's still a lot of darkness. There's still a lot of hurt. There's still a lot of hardship. And we live with that tension. The world is not as it should be, and yet one day it will be. And so how do we live in this tension? There's a difference between sort of distracting ourselves and in hoping. And our hope is not ungrounded. The light of the world has shone. The light has come. There's something new on the horizon. The light has sort of pierced through the darkness. And yet we're still waiting. It's just on the horizon. It's not the noonday sun where the heat of that light will eradicate all darkness. It's still coming. It's still off in the future. And so what we celebrate at Christmas is that light came. That he didn't just sort of leave us behind the wall. He didn't say to us, hey, you know what? You need to get your stuff together. And when you get your stuff together, then I'll come. No, he said, I'm going to break it down. I'm going to lift the curse. And the reality is that when he lifted the curse of the world, for anybody who invites Jesus into their life, he lifts the curse from their life. So that there's no failure, there's no regret, there's no sin, there is no brick that you can build strong enough, high enough, hard enough that can keep God out, because he breaks in. He breaks into our world. And Jesus lived among the brokenness. And then he dealt with the brokenness. Last night when I brought Madison up here, we were practicing a little bit, and I showed her what I was going to do. And she asked a very perceptive question. She said, Chad, why are you building a cross at Christmas? That's for Easter. And it led to a good conversation, because Christmas and the cross are inseparably linked. Jesus came not only to live in our brokenness, he not only broke through the wall of our world, but then with those pieces of our brokenness, he went to the cross and he dealt with it. And so my prayer for all of us is in the next few days, in all of the celebrations, in all of the gatherings, in all of your reflections, that you remember that Christmas begins in the dark, but it doesn't stay there. The light has shone. And God's invitation to all of us is to step with him into the light. To fix our eyes on the horizon, to the light that's coming. And as we do that, he makes us new. He transforms us as we live with him in the light, from the inside out. Let me pray for us, and we're going to respond in worship.